Welcome to HOA anger. The reinspection fee showed up before the storm ended. The tow operator asked for paperwork, and Karen screamed that her authority was the paperwork and the hook was going on now. I stood in the slush beside my sedan, breath fogging in the blue twilight, watching the wrecker idle at the curb with its amber strobes painting the snowbanks orange. The driver, a big guy in a reflective vest, crossed his arms and shook his head. He said he needed the signed order or he was rolling out. Evelyn Young, vendor coordinator for the Driftwood Crossing Association, took 3 fast steps toward him, waving a clipboard like a warrant, and told him his contract required immediate compliance with board directives. The driver looked at me, then back at her, and asked to see the violation notice with my signature or a hearing date. She went silent for 2 seconds, then pivoted to me and said, "Your snow pile is the problem, and you are moving it. I am a rideshare fleet coordinator. I schedule drivers and vehicles across Charlotte, North Carolina, which means I live and breathe logistics, compliance paperwork, and vendor contracts. I know what an enforceable order looks like. I also know what a bluff looks like. And this, standing in front of my townhouse in Driftwood Crossing, on a February evening with 4 inches of fresh snow on the ground and a tow truck that should not even be here, was the loudest bluff I had ever seen." Evelyn had been escalating for 3 weeks. It started with a certified letter demanding fees for snow violations I had never committed, then a fabricated notice with altered dates and recycled photos that claimed I left ice hazards and visible storage. Now she was trying to tow my car out of my own driveway, because she said my snow pile, the one the HOA plow created when it cleared the street, was blocking the fire lane. The fire lane was 20 feet away. The snow pile was maybe 18 inches high and sat entirely on my property. But Evelyn did not care what the weather did, she cared what the rule said. She had said that line twice already today, once on my doorstep and once in a voicemail, and I knew she would say it again before this was over. The stakes were not abstract. I had just closed on this place 6 months ago with a strict lender covenant that required HOA compliance and no liens. I was also scheduled to fly out in 4 days to help my mother recover from surgery, and winter weather was already stacking delays at the airport. If Evelyn managed to file a lien or a bogus tow fee, my mortgage servicer would red flag the account, and I would spend the next 2 months fighting it instead of being where I needed to be. That was the pressure. That was why I stayed calm when she tried to turn my driveway into a crime scene. The tow driver asked her again for the signed work order. Evelyn snapped that the board president had approved it verbally, and that was sufficient. The driver said verbal does not cut it for a private property tow, and he would need documentation. Evelyn turned to me and said she could make this a lien conversation in one email. I stayed calm, because I had one piece of proof that would end the whole game. I did not show it yet. I just looked at the driver and said, "I have dashcam footage of the plow creating that pile, I have timestamped photos, and I have a third-party inspection report proving compliance with every county and HOA standard." The driver raised his eyebrows. Evelyn's face went red. She told him to hook the car anyway. He said, "No, ma'am," and climbed back into the cab. The wrecker pulled away, strobes fading into the snowy dusk, and Evelyn spun on me with her clipboard shaking in her hand. She told me I had 24 hours to remove the snow pile, or she would file an emergency hearing request and pursue collection. I asked her to provide a copy of the winter snow policy she kept citing. She said the winter policy was confidential board material, and I was not entitled to it. I said that was interesting because the county clerk told me HOA governing documents are required to be available to all members. She said I was twisting the law and that her authority was not up for debate. I said I was not debating, I was asking for the document. She said I would get it when the board decided I needed it. Then she walked to her SUV, threw the clipboard onto the passenger seat, and drove off, tires spinning in the slush. I went inside and made 2 calls. The first was to my ally, a guy named Marcus who supervised security for the neighborhood management company. Marcus had been watching Evelyn run this same playbook on 3 other homeowners over the past 2 winters, and he was tired of getting dragged into her demands. He told me she had been calling his dispatcher twice a day asking for incident reports on snow violations that did not exist, and that she had tried to get him to write up homeowners for ice patches that were on county sidewalks, not HOA property. He said if I had proof she was fabricating notices, he would testify at a hearing. The second call was to an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He told me the lien threat was premature and probably unenforceable, but that Evelyn could still make my life miserable with fees and hearing costs if I did not shut it down fast. He said the fastest way to end it was to force the HOA to produce the policy document and then use a records request to expose any contradictions or edits. He also said if the tow vendor contract had expired, any tow order would be void. I asked how I would know if the contract was active. He said request the vendor agreements as part of the records request. I filed the records request that night. I asked for all snow policy documents, all vendor agreements related to towing and property inspections, all board meeting minutes from the past 12 months, and all communications between Evelyn Young and any vendor regarding my address. I sent it certified mail and emailed a copy to the management company and the board president. I also sent a separate email to the regional supervisor for the management company, a woman named Angela, and attached my dashcam footage, my time-stamped photos, and the third-party inspection report I had commissioned 2 weeks earlier when Evelyn first started her campaign. The inspection report was my evidence anchor. I had hired a licensed property compliance inspector to review my lot, my driveway, my snow clearing, and my firewood storage, which Evelyn had also targeted. The inspector found 0 violations and noted in his report that the HOA standards Evelyn was citing did not match the county code or the recorded covenants. He also noted that the photos in Evelyn's fabricated notice appeared to have been taken on different dates and digitally edited. That report was my insurance. But the records request was my weapon. 2 days later, I got a response from the management company. They said the records request fee was $800. I called Angela, the regional supervisor, and asked why a records request for basic governing documents cost $800. She said that was the board-approved fee schedule. I said the fee schedule was not enforceable if it was designed to block access, and that I was entitled to governing documents at reasonable cost under state law. She put me on hold, then came back and said she would waive the fee for governing documents, but the vendor agreements and communications would still require the fee. I said fine, send the governing documents now, and I will decide about the rest. She said she would send them within 5 business days. Evelyn was not waiting. The next morning, I found a new notice taped to my door. This one claimed I had failed to remove the snow pile within the 24-hour deadline, and that I was now subject to daily fines of $100 until compliance. The notice was dated the day before, which meant she had backdated it to make it look like I had ignored a deadline that had not existed when she said it. I took photos of the notice, checked the timestamp on my dashcam footage, and emailed everything to Angela with a subject line that said fabricated notice. Altered dates. Please escalate. Angela replied within an hour and said she was forwarding my complaint to the board president and that she was concerned about the pattern of behavior. She also said the tow vendor contract I had asked about had expired 3 months ago and had not been renewed. That was the twist. Evelyn had been bluffing the tow threat the entire time. The vendor contract was dead. Any tow order she issued was unenforceable. I saved that email and knew I would use it later. That afternoon, Evelyn knocked on my door. I opened it, and she stood there with a handheld infrared thermometer in one hand and her phone in the other. She said she was conducting a safety inspection and needed to measure the surface temperature of my walkway to determine if I was maintaining a slip-free path. I asked if the HOA had authority to enter my property for inspections. She said yes. I asked to see the covenant section that granted that authority. She said she did not need to show me anything and that refusal to cooperate was a separate violation. I said I was not refusing, I was asking for the legal basis. She pointed the infrared thermometer at my walkway, pulled the trigger, and said the reading was 31 degrees, which was below the safe threshold, and that I was now cited for creating a slip hazard. I said the walkway was dry and the county had not issued any ice advisories. She said she did not care what the weather did, she cared what the rule said. I said, show me the rule. She said she already told me the winter policy was confidential. Then she took a photo of my walkway with her phone and walked away. I called Marcus. He said Evelyn had been using the infrared thermometer on 4 other properties that week, and that none of the citations had gone to hearings, because the homeowners either paid the fines or moved. He said she was treating the neighborhood like a compliance factory, and that the board president was letting her do it because he did not want the confrontation. I asked Marcus if he would be willing to document the pattern. He said yes, and that he had already started keeping a log of her calls and complaints. I thanked him and told him I would keep him in the loop. The records came 3 days later. The management company sent me a PDF packet with the covenants, the bylaws, and the rules and regulations. I read through the winter section. It said homeowners were responsible for clearing walkways within 24 hours of a snow event and for removing snow piles that blocked common areas or fire lanes. It did not mention surface temperature. It did not mention infrared inspections. It did not mention daily fines. It did not mention confidential policies. I compared the rule text to the citations Evelyn had been issuing. Nothing matched. She was enforcing rules that did not exist. I also noticed something else. The bylaws required the board to approve any fine schedule by majority vote in a recorded meeting. I searched the meeting minutes. There was no vote on a winter fine schedule. There was no vote on inspection protocols. There was no vote authorizing Evelyn to act as an enforcement officer. She had been making it up as she went. I called Angela again and told her what I found. She said she was not surprised and that Evelyn had been operating outside the board's authority for months. I asked why the management company had not stopped her. Angela said the board president was conflict-averse and Evelyn was aggressive, so the company had been waiting for a homeowner to push back with documentation. I said I am that homeowner. She said good, and that if I wanted to escalate, I should bring everything to the next board meeting and request a hearing. The meeting was in 6 days. I said I would be there. Evelyn was not done. 2 days before the meeting, she launched her first set piece. I came home from work to find an orange traffic cone sitting in the middle of the street directly in front of my driveway. I moved it to the curb. The next morning, it was back in the street. I moved it again. That afternoon, I was working from home when I heard a commotion outside. I looked out the window and saw Evelyn dragging the cone from the curb into the street, positioning it in front of my driveway, and then standing beside it with her phone, recording video. A delivery van was stopped at the curb behind her, waiting. The driver honked. Evelyn ignored him. I grabbed my coat and went outside. I asked Evelyn what she was doing. She said she was documenting a hazard. I asked what hazard. She said my snow pile had forced her to place the cone in the street for safety, and that the delivery van blockage was my fault. I looked at the snow pile. It was still 18 inches high, still entirely on my property, and still 20 feet from the fire lane. I said, "You moved the cone into the street." She said she was acting in her official capacity as vendor coordinator and that her actions were authorized. The delivery driver yelled out his window and asked if someone could move the cone so he could get past. Evelyn told him to wait. I walked over, picked up the cone, and moved it to my yard. Evelyn shouted that I was tampering with official safety equipment. The delivery driver gave me a thumbs up and drove off. Evelyn filmed the whole thing, then got in her SUV and left. I went inside and added the incident to my evidence file. The delivery driver became an unexpected witness. His name was Troy, and he came back an hour later to finish his route. He knocked on my door and said he had watched the whole thing and that if I needed a statement, he would give one. He said Evelyn had pulled the same stunt on another street 2 weeks earlier, and that his supervisor had filed a complaint with the management company. I thanked him and got his contact information. That was 2 witnesses now, Marcus and Troy, both willing to go on record. The second set piece happened the night before the board meeting. Evelyn went door to door with a petition. I watched from my window as she walked up and down the street, clipboard in hand, knocking on doors and talking to neighbors. I could not hear what she was saying, but I saw her pointing at my townhouse. After she left, one of my neighbors, an older guy named Frank, who lived 3 doors down, came over and told me Evelyn was collecting signatures for a motion to impose emergency snow enforcement and to authorize immediate towing and fines for non-compliance. He said she told everyone I was refusing to follow the rules and creating safety hazards. Frank said he did not sign it because he had seen my walkway and driveway and they were cleaner than most of the street. He also said Evelyn told people the board president had already approved the motion and the petition was just a formality. I thanked Frank and added his name to my witness list. The board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building at the edge of the neighborhood with a meeting room, a kitchenette, and a handful of folding chairs. I arrived early with my evidence packet, my laptop, and Marcus. Angela, the regional supervisor, was already there, sitting in the back with a notepad. The board president, a man named Derek who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, sat at the front table with 2 other board members. Evelyn sat beside him, infrared thermometer on the table in front of her like a gavel. The room filled up slowly. About 15 homeowners showed up, more than usual, probably because Evelyn had been campaigning. Derek called the meeting to order and asked if there was any new business. Evelyn stood up and said she had a motion. If you are enjoying this story, hit like and subscribe for more wild HOA showdowns where the Karens lose and the evidence wins. She said the board needed to adopt emergency enforcement measures for winter safety, including daily fines, immediate towing authority, and inspection protocols. She said she had a petition with 12 signatures supporting the motion. Derek looked uncomfortable. He asked if the motion had been reviewed by the management company. Angela stood up and said no, and that any fine schedule or enforcement policy required a recorded vote and member notice under the bylaws. Evelyn said this was an emergency, and the bylaws allowed the board to act in urgent situations. Angela said the bylaws did not authorize emergency rulemaking without notice. Derek asked Evelyn to sit down. She did not. She said the board had a duty to protect the neighborhood from negligent homeowners like me. She pointed at me. She said I had refused to comply with multiple notices, that I had tampered with safety equipment, and that I had created a slip hazard that could result in liability. I stood up. I said I would like to respond. Derek said go ahead. I said every citation I had received was based on rules that did not exist in the governing documents, that the notices had been backdated and contained fabricated evidence, and that the vendor contract Evelyn used to threaten towing had expired 3 months ago. I pulled out my evidence packet and handed copies to Derek, Angela, and the 2 other board members. I said I had dashcam footage, timestamp photos, a third-party inspection report, and witness statements. I also said I had filed a records request that exposed the vendor contract issue and that I was prepared to share the proof with everyone in the room. Evelyn's face went pale. She said I was lying. I opened my laptop, connected it to the projector on the wall, and played the dashcam footage. It showed the HOA plow creating the snow pile on my property, the tow truck arriving, and the driver refusing to hook my car. It showed Evelyn yelling at the driver and saying her authority was the paperwork. The room went silent. I said the footage was time-stamped and matched the date on Evelyn's first backdated notice. I said the inspection report proved compliance with every standard, and that the infrared thermometer readings were not part of any approved policy. I said Marcus, the security supervisor, and Troy, the delivery driver, were both willing to testify about the pattern of fabrications and harassment. Marcus stood up from the back row and nodded. Derek asked Evelyn if she had anything to say. She said the winter policy authorized her actions. I said, "Show us the winter policy." She did not answer. Derek asked Angela if there was a confidential winter policy. Angela said no, and that the only winter rules were the ones in the governing documents I had just cited. Derek asked Evelyn why she had been citing rules that did not exist. She said she was interpreting the governing documents in the best interest of the community. Derek said that was not how it worked. One of the other board members, a woman named Lisa, asked Evelyn if she had altered the dates on any notices. Evelyn said no. I pulled up the fabricated notice on the projector and showed the metadata. The file had been created 2 days after the date printed on the notice. Lisa asked Evelyn to explain. Evelyn said the metadata was irrelevant. Lisa said it was not. Derek said this was a serious issue and that the board needed to suspend enforcement pending an investigation. Evelyn said that would create a safety crisis. Derek said the only crisis was the liability the HOA faced if Evelyn kept issuing bogus citations. He called for a motion to suspend all winter enforcement actions and to require documented evidence and 2 board approvals before any tow or fine. Lisa seconded. The motion passed 3-0. Evelyn did not vote. She sat down, jaw clenched, staring at the infrared thermometer. I was not done. I stood up again and said I wanted the board to address the retaliation. I said Evelyn had targeted me with fabricated notices, backdated documents, bogus fees, harassment, and threats, and that I wanted a formal retraction and a refund of any fees paid by other homeowners who had been subjected to the same treatment. Derek said he would take it under advisement. I said that was not good enough. I said I had already provided the evidence to Angela, and that if the board did not act, I would file a complaint with the state HOA ombudsman and pursue a civil claim. Angela stood up and said the management company supported a full investigation and that she recommended the board require Evelyn to provide a written retraction and reimburse any disputed fees. Derek asked Evelyn if she was willing to do that. She said no. Derek said then the board would vote on it. Lisa made the motion. The other board member, a man named Greg, seconded. The motion passed 3-0. Evelyn stood up, grabbed her infrared thermometer, and tried to walk out. Frank, the neighbor who had refused to sign the petition, stood up and asked if there was a motion on record from Evelyn. Derek said no. Frank said then she did not move emergency enforcement, she just made a speech. The room laughed. Evelyn froze in the doorway, turned around, and said this was not over. Derek said yes it was. Angela walked me out after the meeting. She said the board would be holding a special session to review the vendor contracts and the enforcement protocols, and that Evelyn would likely be removed from the vendor coordinator role. She also said the management company would be issuing a formal apology to me and the other affected homeowners, and that any fees or fines would be refunded. I asked about the records request. She said the rest of the documents would be provided within the week at no charge, and that the $800 fee policy would be rescinded. I thanked her and told her I appreciated her support. She said I had done the work, she just made sure it did not get buried. The Showdown location was not the meeting. It was the tow yard 3 days later. Evelyn had tried one last move. She called a different tow company, one that was not on the expired vendor list, and told them the board had authorized an immediate tow of my vehicle for a fire lane violation. The driver showed up at 6 in the morning. I was awake. I heard the truck. I went outside in my coat and boots, evidence packet in hand, and asked the driver what he was doing. He said he had a work order from the HOA. I said, "Show me." He handed me a printed email. It was from Evelyn, sent at midnight, claiming the board had voted to authorize emergency towing. I said that was a lie. I pulled out my phone and showed him the board meeting minutes from 3 days earlier, which Angela had emailed me, showing the motion to suspend all enforcement. I also showed him the expired vendor contract email and explained that any tow order from Evelyn was void. The driver read everything, then called his dispatcher. He told the dispatcher the HOA was bluffing and that he was not hooking the car without a signed order from the board president. The dispatcher told him to leave. The driver looked at me and said, "Sorry for the trouble." I said, "No worries, thank you for checking." He drove off. Evelyn pulled up 30 seconds later in her SUV, saw the tow truck leaving, and got out screaming. She said I had interfered with an authorized action. I said the action was not authorized, and she knew it. She said she still had board authority. I said no, she did not, and that the board had voted to remove her enforcement powers. She said that vote was procedural and non-binding. I said it was recorded in the minutes and enforceable. She pulled out her phone and said she was calling the police. I said, "Go ahead." She dialed. A county sheriff deputy arrived 15 minutes later. Evelyn told him I was trespassing on HOA authority and obstructing safety enforcement. The deputy asked me for my side. I showed him the evidence packet, the board minutes, the expired vendor contract email, and the dashcam footage. The deputy asked Evelyn if she had any documentation. She said her clipboard was documentation. The deputy said a clipboard was not a legal order. He told her if she called another tow company without board authorization, she could be charged with filing a false report. He told me I was fine and to call if she came back. He left. Evelyn stood in the street, orange cone in one hand, phone in the other, and said this was not over. I said yes, it was. The records request response came 2 days later. Angela sent me everything, no fee. The documents confirmed what I already knew. The winter policy Evelyn had been citing did not exist. The vendor contracts had expired. The board had never voted on daily fines or infrared inspections. But there was one more piece. The communications file included email threads between Evelyn and 3 different vendors, where she had promised them exclusive contracts in exchange for fast response times and no questions asked. She had been trying to build a personal enforcement network outside the management company oversight. Angela had flagged the emails and forwarded them to the board president with a recommendation to terminate Evelyn's role immediately. Derek called an emergency board meeting. Evelyn was removed as vendor coordinator. The board voted to require actual evidence before fines and to adopt a 2-approval process for any enforcement action. They also voted to send formal retractions to every homeowner Evelyn had cited in the past year and to refund all disputed fees. Evelyn sent me one final email. She said I had destroyed the neighborhood safety system and that I would regret it when someone got hurt. I forwarded the email to Angela and the board president with a note that said this looks like retaliation and harassment. Please document. Angela replied within an hour and said Evelyn had been barred from any HOA role for 3 years and that the management company was considering a formal complaint to the state. I never heard from Evelyn again. The winter ended. The snow melted. I flew out to help my mother and came back 3 weeks later. The neighborhood was quiet. The new vendor coordinator, a retired engineer named Tom, introduced himself and said he was reviewing all the old citations to make sure they were valid. He found 6 more homeowners who had been targeted by Evelyn with fabricated notices. All of them got refunds and apologies. The board adopted new rules requiring transparency, member access to all governing documents, and a formal appeals process. Marcus told me Evelyn had tried to get her job back by claiming the board had acted improperly, but that Angela shut it down with the evidence file. Frank told me the petition Evelyn had circulated never went anywhere, because half the people who signed it thought they were signing a snow removal service sign-up sheet, not an enforcement motion. Troy, the delivery driver, sent me a message saying his supervisor had used the incident in a training session on HOA interference. I kept the dashcam running. I kept the evidence packet. I kept every email. Because the one thing I learned from Driftwood Crossing was that an HOA will only respect you if you make them. Evelyn Young thought she could turn my driveway into a citation factory. She thought she could bluff her way through vendor contracts and fabricate notices and nobody would check. She thought her clipboard and her infrared thermometer and her orange cones were enough to make people believe she had authority. She was wrong. And when she tried to make it a lean conversation, she walked into a records request that exposed years of bogus fees and hidden edits and vendor kickback schemes. The board voted reforms. Evelyn was forced to retract her claim in writing. The HOA stopped treating winter like an excuse to print money, and I got to spend 3 quiet weeks helping my family without a single threatening voicemail. I hope your mailbox cluster stays quiet.